hello, everyone, and my name is Gustavo Saposnik. I'm one of the editor-in-chief for the World Stroke Academy, the educational platform of the World Stroke Organization. Today, we have the privilege to have Clay Johnston. I think that he's very well known for all of you, but for those who don't know him, so he's a professor of neurology at Dell Medical School at the University of Texas in Austin, United States. From 2014 to 2021, he was the inaugural dean of the Dell Medical School at the University of Texas in Austin. So as you know, Clay specialized in stroke care and research. He has been the author of many hundreds of publications already and the principal investigators of many of the studies that you have read regarding stroke prevention and TIAs. He developed one of the initial risk scores to predict the potential progression of patient with a TIA to having a stroke, published in JAMA 2020. And sorry, in JAMA 2000. So Clay, thank you very much for joining us, and very much appreciated.
Well, thank you, Gustavo. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see you again.
Excellent. So to get started, so again, this is mostly about stroke prevention, but we are going to focus in few questions today about the editorial that you wrote with Don Easton a few weeks ago. So the question is, imagine that I'm a sleeping beauty. I wake up today after knowing, about the ABCD2 score, the importance of the TIA concept, and now I read your editorial and you are saying, well, it's time to retire the concept. So how do you deconstruct the concept of TIA that you worked hard for many years? So can you share your vision to the rest of the audience?
Sure. Well, I think that, that journey, and you described it well, Gustavo. First, it was just a question, are TIAs dangerous? Are they something bad that we need to worry about? And, 25 years ago, a lot of people just blew them off. Oh, that's just a little thing. It's like a migraine or whatever, just leave it alone. And some people took them very seriously as an opportunity to prevent strokes, but we didn't even know what the stroke risk was in the short term. Then once we found, okay, the stroke risk is actually quite high, and we can find a subgroup of folks whose symptoms go away and their risk is even higher, really extremely high, higher than having a major heart attack with chest pain, really high rates. Then attitudes started to change, but they changed slowly. And also during that period, we discovered that a lot of those that we were calling TIAs had infarction. And then we created additional consternation by changing the TIA definition to exclude those with any infarction for some reason, and one could say, well, there's infarction there, so of course it's a stroke. And part of the rationale for doing that was to get people to at least take that subset more seriously, the ones with transient symptoms but with infarction. But the reality is that's just created more confusion and has more people worried about differentiating TIAs from strokes when that's not really the relevant question. The relevant question is, did they have an event that was ischemic? If they did, they have a high risk of subsequent events, right? And yes, seeing an infarction on the scan helps you to identify that. But as you know, as we've gotten better and better at scanning, and eventually we'll have better and better biomarkers in the blood to say that the brain was injured, we're going to find that all of those with real episodes that were ischemic are going to have some brain damage. And so that's our saying, let's just get rid of TIA. It's distracting people. Patients are confused by it. They even come to us and tell us, oh, that's a mini stroke, right, doc? Yeah, I mean, they're kind of telling us what works for them conceptually as a simpler notion than some whole new term. And I think too, it'll be simpler for us conceptually to move the field forward. I will say that the one complication that we did not deal with in that paper is we used to know in our heads that some TIAs were mimics. We allowed for that, right? That's really how the ABCD squared score works. It identifies, at least we think, the real ischemic events versus the non-ischemic events. And we didn't give an out for a possible stroke. You know, if we call all TIAs strokes now, a possible minor stroke or a probable minor stroke, we didn't give any framework for that. So that's and also, of course, we're, you know, dealing with all this literature, just as you said, that was pushing in a different direction on you know, establishing the importance of this category.
Thank you, Clay. That's more revealing and explanatory. So the next question is regarding some, you know, medical legal implications of this change, for example. As you know, as a practicing stroke neurologist, one of the most common questions that comes when people have to travel. So for example, let's imagine somebody that is a 78-year-old man or woman, you know, who has history of either hypertension or diabetes that is traveling, let's say, from North America to Asia. And the question is about travel insurance. He had, or that person had an self-resolving motor event with hemiparesis and dysarthria lasting for 25 minutes. An MRI done the following day revealed a mild microangiopathic changes, but no restricted diffusion. So the question is, the patient was wondering how he or she would answer that question. Did I have a stroke?
Yeah.
Did I have a TIA?
Well, so I would say, you know, currently they would probably say they had a TIA. We would encourage them to just say, I had a minor stroke. The reality is where they are in terms of the implications for the future are the same. They either had a high-risk TIA or in the current framework or a minor stroke. And the risk of having another event is the same in those groups. I mean, of course, having infarction tells you it's a real ischemic event, so it's not quite the same, but it's pretty much the same. So it shouldn't matter. So, you know, your question is, well, when do we start to flip the terminology? And I think right now, all we did was create noise for you guys to figure out. So basically, this was just a shot across the bow to say, hey, look, it's time to rethink this. We need a group to come together and get consensus on what makes sense going forward. And we're just two people who've been studying this for a while. We don't represent all the interests, and just to recognize too, like, this stuff has all kinds of other implications beyond the excellent point that you've raised. Like the WHO still uses the older definition of TIA that doesn't include infarction. If the symptoms go away, it's a TIA according to the WHO, regardless of whether there's infarct on the scan or not. And the reason, of course, they do that is that many places can't do any imaging. So they just would prefer to have those called TIAs. So, there's great complexity in the next steps, and the societies, including the World Stroke Organization, it's an opportunity for them to say, no, Easton and Johnston are crazy, just let it die. Or say, okay, there is something here. Maybe it's time for us to reevaluate these terms.
And perhaps starting using, the conceptualization of a minor stroke, as you mentioned. Okay, a very good point. One of the other question is, given your previous role and recent role as a dean, the question is, as you know, that one of the most difficult challenges in medical education is trying to overcome knowledge to action gaps. Knowledge gaps is known how to educate, medical students, physicians, etc. But knowledge to action gaps are more difficult. So what's the future? What's your vision in terms of the future of medical education that may translate into an action? What's your vision regarding effective educational intervention to reduce, for example, the status quo or the therapeutic inertia in stroke prevention?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, Gustavo. And you know, I've spent a lot of my career thinking about that issue, not just in stroke, but overall. I think, you know, look, we had, you know, years ago, we had TPA and it was almost never used. And it really took us creating a whole system of care around it, and including monitoring and feedback that was quite public and associated with status that others could know, in order to produce a system that worked and increased use of TPA. For management of secondary stroke prevention, we need the same thing, right? We have some of that in the US anyway, and get with the guidelines, and in international registries that are used for stroke center accreditation. But we need to add in these minor stroke TIAs, whatever you want to call them, they need to be added in there as well, because they're, you know, they're complex things that are required, that need to be done to prevent additional events in those folks. More generally, I think it's dysfunction in our health system. We rely too much on individuals and their memory and knowledge and ability to bring together a whole mess of different facts from the individual patient, but also from the literature. And that's just not going to work as things have gotten more and more complicated. There's too many opportunities to fail. We need to take a systems approach to the way we deliver care. And so we need to say, hey, it's our job is to create a system that fires off the right processes for everyone that enters it. And that, you know, we have a ton of data that's collected, and we have, you know, you don't need AI even to do this. People love to say we do, and then AI will have a role, I'm sure, because it's a way for people to raise money for whatever it is they're doing. But the reality is we can create those, you know, alerts and warnings and systems to improve outcomes. Once we've done that, there's a huge opportunity to actually use randomization within that system to accelerate how quickly new knowledge is added. But with the huge noise and biases that exist in current care, as you and I both know, as doing observational studies as well, it's really hard to learn from our current system. We pretend like we can, but you can't always adjust for all these sources of bias. So creating that, a real system, and introducing noise when there's uncertainty, maybe using adaptive models to get to certainty, that's got to be our future. When we get there, I don't know, we're so slow to change, right? So, and I think it's going to take us a while to develop that system.
So going back, and if I can ask you, if I may, are you referring, to be more specific, as the literature regarding reducing medical errors on one hand? Are you referring to some strategies that has been, you know, used, for example, to have automatic medical system that, you know, issue a red flag when you are making a mistake, or to prevent a mistake? Are you referring to those?
Those are table stakes, is what I would say. Yes, there are plenty of errors that produce harm, but even more important to outcomes are opportunities to do the next thing, where there's no, you know, warning or trigger or handoff for that to happen. And I'll give you, to me, the most, in our field, the biggest example of that is our inability to get hypertension controlled in the population. Okay, so we've got, that's incredibly common, right? And you'd reduce the stroke risk by more than 50%. The overall stroke mortality and incidence would be reduced by 50% or more if you just treated hypertension. The medicines are super cheap. There are lots of them. They're extremely well tolerated. We know how to measure blood pressure. That's super cheap. It's not hard to do. It's done in many places. And yet we still have trouble getting above 50% of the population with hypertension adequately treated. That doesn't make sense, right? That's a failure of our systems. And that's global, right? That's not just in developed countries where you'd think that could be prioritized. It's not just in these really progressive developing countries too. They have room, but in some ways they do better. It's also, Africa, it's a great example of, wow, what would have a huge impact there? Stroke risks are huge there. That would. But the systems are not in place that support us doing that. Some of it is financial too. I think that we would have prioritized these systems. Our electronic health records were prioritized, at least in the US, to increase billing for our activities, not to improve outcomes for our patients. If our electron, and that's because that's where the money is. They want to generate the money. If the money was around getting hypertension treated, around achieving those outcomes, then we would have those systems and we would all be disciplined around them.
So you believe that essentially it requires to have some, punishment, or the other way around, some, rewards for physicians who are able to to effectively control blood pressure, for example?
Well, with your behavioral economics expertise, Gustavo, I'll leave the combination of rewards and pain to you to dole out. But absolutely, that's it. The systems, and it's not just for the physician, right? It's the whole system that's built around the physician. Because some of this, like, why don't we get hypertension controlled? Well, we as neurologists, we see them once after their stroke. We're not taking over their hypertension care. Then they go to their primary care doc, but when, how often? It really, in order for it to work, you need the system to care about that. Did they fill their script for their antihypertensive? Do they appear to be taking it? Has somebody measured it? And be proactive, even with like a coach level person. Doesn't even need to be a nurse to do that measurement, to give the feedback to the patient, all of that stuff. We don't do that. We don't use those roles. We don't have those systems, in part, again, because of the way we get paid. Those people don't get paid. Only the doctor's visit really is reimbursed. And so we force everything back on the doctor, whereas we feel like hypertension, that's easy, that should be taken care of elsewhere, not by us. We've got to figure out whether, whether they need Botox or not for their rehab, and whether, we need to repeat an angiogram. Those are the things that feel more appropriate for us to be focused on.
So thank you, Clay. So it's also, as you mentioned before, trying to fight our own biases and also nausea about, like the SHARP study in hypertension that you mentioned, is that when you ask, physicians how well your patients are controlled, you may say 70% believe that their patients are well controlled. It's over 15 years ago, that trial. And when you monitor the blood pressure in those patients, only half of them have the blood pressure under control. So it's very important, our own nausea or belief. So thank you very much, Clay. And again, just to wrap up, so I didn't mention at the beginning, but if you ask people around the world, who is Clay Johnston? People will say, well, he developed the ABCD score. He is, the PI of many trials. But more importantly, people, when you ask, they said, he's a nice guy. And I think that that's something that, I witnessed before. So Clay, thank you very much appreciated your vision and sharing with the WSA and the WSO your thoughts. Thank you.
My pleasure, Gustavo. Great to talk to you.
Thank you very much.